Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So, as said, my name is Vanessa for FSSA. I am the Service Enrichment and Advancement Director, and actually, all that is in my slides, so I won't go over it too much with you. But one of the things that I oversee is Adult Protective Services. So, I will be here today to talk to you about APS in Indiana and exploitation within our system.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Vanessa. With that, let's go ahead and dive in.
All right, let's dive in. This is probably going to be the quickest session that you attend in your Core 40, since we're just covering a small piece of APS for today. We will be going over, in general, an overview of adult protective services, and then just honing in a couple of slides on sexual exploitation for the state and globally. So let's go ahead and jump into this. This is essentially what I just went over. So I'll give you the breakdown of how APS works in Indiana. We actually just went through to a new contract recently in July, so we've got a little bit of changes there to talk about. We're going to talk about indicators and prevalence. We're also going to give you information on reporting so that if you ever feel like you need to report something, you know how to do that. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And this is me. So we are now called the Bureau of Better Aging. You may be more familiar with us being referred to as the Division of Aging. We just recently merged with the Division of Disability and Resources. So we are now part of DDARS, and we are now a bureau rather than a division. Otherwise, we're essentially the same business as usual, still managing the same program, still doing the same. I'm the Service Enrichment and Advancement Director. So I oversee adult protective services as well as PASSAR slash LCAR. And if you're not familiar with either of those programs, don't you worry about it. We won't have to go into those details today. And then I also oversee all of our outreach and education initiatives. Pravi is not able to join us today, but Pravi Najar is our Adult Protective Services Director. And I just wanted to be sure that you had her name and her email, so that if you have any questions in the future about Indiana APS, you know who to talk to, because she'll be able to give you a more direct response. All right, so let's talk about Indiana Adult Protective Services, who we are, what we do, and where we're now located. I mean, obviously Indiana, but what does that look like? So this is the biggest change thus far with our APS system since we shifted in July. So we used to be within the prosecutor's offices across the state, the prosecutor hubs. And so there were 17 different units that we contracted with to do APS work. Now we have one contract with one provider, and they cover the entire state. And we are divided into 5 different regions that were, those regions were based on population. We have one operational manager through that contractor who oversees all of the operations for the state. And then we have one supervisor per region. We have a field staff of currently about 42, or I'm sorry, 48. I'm reading my numbers wrong. We have a field staff currently of 42. Our current total is about 48 staff in general across the state. And then we have our director, Bobby. We have an assistant director. Her name is Sherry. And we have one person who provides administrative support. And actually, that person just left. So I need to update this slide because we no longer have that one person for our administrative support. But this is what our current layout is. And if you go to that website that's there on the page, and you scroll over the different regions, you can get information, contact information for each of those supervisors so that you have that more direct person that you can get a hold of if ever you should need to get a hold of somebody in that region specifically. And then later in the conversation, I will give you the information for how to make a report. So while you can get a hold of them at any point, if need be, there's still like the specific hotline that has to be gone through if a report is going to be made. Okay, so out of curiosity, and feel free to just pop this in the chat or come off mute, whichever you're more comfortable with or able to do. I don't even know if you're able to come off mute, but so we know that there's going to be a population surge, right? I'm sure you've heard that 1,000 times. Do you have any idea of what that is projected to be by 2050, which is getting to be much closer? All right, let's take a look. I see we have one that says no idea. Yeah, we just know there is going to be a surge, right? All right. So this is what we're looking at. So back in 2022, our population for adults 65 and over was 58 million. This is national numbers. For 2050, we're expecting that to rise all the way up to 82 million, which is going to be like 23% of our population, 47% increase. Quite drastic. When I first started doing when I first started working for APS, which was about 10 years ago, we we first began presenting this data. Back then, we were even not even looking as far as 2050. We were still looking at where we would be in 2030. And at this point, of course, we had to update that because the number just continues to rise. And as far as we can tell, that isn't going to plateau anytime soon. So it's just something that we need to be prepared for. All right, let's talk specifically about exploitation data. So I'm sure that you know, but just in case, Adult Protective Services, we look at abuse, neglect, and exploitation of older adults. And that abuse could be physical, it could be emotional, and our neglect can be often it's caregiver neglect is the most common. But in Indiana, we also investigate cases of self neglect, where a person is unable to make their own decisions and unable to direct their own care. And then, of course, we also have exploitation. We have financial exploitation, sexual exploitation, and work exploitation, right? So it could be any of those three things, the most common being financial exploitation. That one is so common and so prevalent that there's a whole other presentation that can last at least an hour on financial exploitation. So I will not go deep into that for you today, since that's not why we're here to talk today. But do know that that is the primary form that we see. So this slide actually gives you a really good understanding of that. So this is our prevalence for 2024. We had 4,490 cases of exploitation total. So that could have been for labor or for financial or for sexual exploitation. 22 of those were sexual exploitation. None of those were labor. So that tells you how much higher our cases of financial exploitation are. And of those 22, right around 5 were substantiated. So the others, it doesn't necessarily mean like if we're saying substantiated, we just mean we were able to substantiate that the person was somebody who would be considered an endangered adult by Indiana standards. So they were 18 or above, and they were being threatened with some kind of harm, in this particular case, sexual exploitation. And we were able to find evidence of that harm. So those are your 22 cases. If we have situations where maybe it got reported for sexual exploitation, but we found a different, maybe we didn't find evidence for that, but we found evidence for neglect. And then the substantiation would show as something for neglect. So that would be a separate data number for our prevalence, just to give you an idea of how these numbers are found. One of those involved law enforcement directly. So anything that involves a potential criminal case, we are going to get law enforcement involved. And for Indiana, when it comes to sexual exploitation specifically, we lean heavily on law enforcement to manage those cases, particularly where we're seeing that criminal activity piece, primarily because law enforcement has very strict standards, as I'm sure you know, for how to interview and how to talk to different potential case members who may be involved, family members, etc., witnesses. They're going to be trained in forensic interviewing. Our APS investigators are not specifically trained in forensic interviewing. So when it comes to sexual exploitation, we make sure to refer those to law enforcement immediately so that we are working closely together and people can receive the proper investigation that they should have in these cases, right? The proper forensic interviewing, the proper kind of witness interviewing, the proper kind of evidence collection, etc. If law enforcement does find criminal activity, they can take that and run with it, do what they need to do on the criminal side of things. Even if law enforcement does not find any criminal activity, but APS still finds activity, then we can still substantiate. It just won't necessarily be something that law enforcement continues on. And here we have some basic numbers for US and global prevalence. So you're going to see here And this is all self reported, by the way. So, all of this is self reported data. And at the end of the presentation, report. So, you can go in and read those if you're interested. So here we have sexual abuse was most often perpetrated by a partner or spouse. That's 40%. Acquaintances was another 40%. Between zero point 0.6 and 0.9% of older adults reported experiencing sexual abuse. And that number is a bit of a range, again, because of the self reporting aspect. So that's pulling together different reports from different places and saying, like, okay, it was between zero point 0.6 and zero point 0.9, depending on where you're looking. The global prevalence for sexual abuse in older adult women was 2.2%. And about 2% of older adults in institutions self reported experiencing sexual abuse as well. So that gives you an understanding of where we're seeing the highest prevalence, both for victims as well as for abusers. And this is pretty consistent with other types of older adult abuse, and not even just older adult, but vulnerable adults. So even our younger adults who are in vulnerable situations, perhaps due to a disability or a cognitive decline or a number of other possible issues. We find that typically it is going to be a partner or a primary caregiver who is most often the perpetrator, followed by a caregiver who is not related to the individual, and then followed by just someone else, someone they met or a stranger or someone who they barely know, right? So that is the most common way these types of abuse tend to. All right, let's talk about reporting. So in Indiana, everyone is considered a mandatory reporter. So if you suspect anything at all on any case with adult abuse, the expectation is that it will be reported. A lot of institutions, like educational institutions, health institutions, often have their own policies for how they want to see these things reported. So sometimes they will want the individual with the most information to make the report. Sometimes they'll want the supervisor to make the report. So just make sure that you're on the up and up with whatever a policy may be for where you are working. But at the end of the day, the report still has to be made by someone. Everyone's a mandatory reporter. A failure report is technically a Class B misdemeanor. We do not come for people who have failed to report unless we have some kind of evidence that it wasn't just a neglect to report, it was an active choice, that there was knowledge of abuse and someone chose not to report that, had the opportunity to report it, chose not to report it. And then we might be, having a conversation about, hey, that's a failure to report Class B misdemeanor. And people do have immunity as well in Indiana. So if you're making a report on good faith, if you really think there might be something going on, you suspect there's something going on, you cannot be sued, you cannot be fired for that. It's only reports that are made that are false reports that are made repeatedly with an intent to harm. If you're making a report in good faith, you are protected in this way. And then here are the Indiana codes for that as well, just in case you're curious and want to dig into the actual law. And I also always tell people, especially when it comes to, us, the whole state being a mandatory reporter, you don't have to worry about whether or not you think you have enough evidence. You don't have to stress that out. If you have any inkling of a suspicion of a possibility that something is going on, we encourage you to make the report. We will figure out whether or not something is actually going. You do not have to gather a bunch of evidence before you make a call. If you suspect anything and you have enough information to tell us, where the alleged victim, lives or how to get a hold of them in some way, that is enough. That's enough. You don't have to have a ton to make the call. And then here is how you can report. So we've got our 1-800 number. That is staffed during normal business hours. And then there is a voicemail for overnight and weekend where someone, as soon as the morning comes and it's clocked in, we'll be checking those voicemails and returning those calls. So that's our 1-800 number. And then, of course, we have our website. Personally, I'm a computer child before I'm a phone child. I'm more likely to make a report on the website. I find it to just be a lot easier. I don't have to wait on hold. I can just put all the information in right then and there. It's pretty quick. There's not a whole lot to it. You'll know which pieces are critical because there's a little red asterisk if it's mandatory. And if you call the 1-800 number, they're using the exact same website. So calling the 1-800, they are typing in your information into this website. And then what happens is when it's done and sent through, whether that be by you or by someone at the hotline, then it automatically goes to the supervisor at the appropriate region. So either is perfectly fine. Neither is, you're not going to lose information doing it one way or the other. It's going to be the same thing, the same form, same stuff. So whichever one works best for you, go for it. Okay. And that's really, I mean, that is the whole presentation for Adult Protective Services for sexual exploitation. Because as you saw, we have an average of about 20 cases a year. So there's not a ton that happens with it. But I am absolutely here to answer any other questions you may have about APS or about how these investigations are run. We have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for all of this very helpful information.
Absolutely. And if you do have future questions, of course, you've got my email and you've got Pravi's email. So you know exactly who to reach out to if you ever need more information.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you very much.
And for everyone else, our next session, it will be our final session of the day and of the week. It will begin at 3 o'clock